My Aunt Roberta called me a failure at my cousin's wedding. Not quietly, not in the careful, deniable way that some people deliver their cruelties. The raised eyebrow, the loaded pause, the comment that could be walked back if challenged. Roberta was not that kind of person. She said it in the middle of the reception, at a table with 6 other people, in the particular tone of someone who has been thinking it for years and has simply found the occasion to say it out loud. She said I had wasted my education. She said my apartment was embarrassing for someone my age. She said my career, she used air quotes when she said the word career, was something she would be ashamed to explain to her friends. I was 34 years old. I was sitting in a rental tuxedo because I couldn't afford to buy one. I had exactly $1,100 in my checking account. I had a studio apartment in a city where studio apartments cost more than most people's mortgages. I had a job that paid me a salary that sounded reasonable until you divided it by the actual hours I worked. And I had a second job on evenings and weekends that paid me in cash and that I had not told my family about because I knew, with the precision of someone who has been studied carefully by people who mean them harm, exactly what Roberta would do with that information. I sat at that table and I listened to her say all of it. And I nodded in the measured way that I had learned was the only appropriate response to Roberta, and I did not tell her what I knew, what I had known for almost 2 years, what I had been very carefully, very deliberately, not telling anyone. My name is Marcus Webb, and the thing I had not told Roberta, the thing I had not told anyone in my family, was that 6 months before her son's wedding, I had become the majority owner of a company that had been quietly funding Roberta's entire professional life for the past 11 years. Let me tell you about my father's brother, a man named Gerald Webb, who most of the family called Uncle Jerry, but who I called, from the time I was old enough to understand what he actually was, the person who saw me. Jerry was the odd one in the Webb family in the way that some people are odd, not in temperament or behavior, but in scale. He had built something the rest of the family did not fully comprehend, partly because Jerry did not discuss it with them, and partly because the family was not inclined to look closely at things that didn't directly affect their immediate circumstances. He had started a specialty chemicals distribution company in his early 30s. Unglamorous, industrial, the kind of business that doesn't come up at dinner parties, but generates the kind of consistent margin that compounds quietly over decades. The company was called Meridian Supply Group. It had taken Jerry 20 years to build it into something significant. I knew about Meridian because Jerry told me. He told me things he told very few other people, which I understood even as a teenager was a form of trust that carried weight. He would take me to lunch. Just the 2 of us, a habit we started when I was about 15 and continued until the end of his life. And he would talk about the business the way my father never talked about anything, concretely, honestly, with a willingness to include the failures alongside the successes. He talked about the mistakes he had made in his first decade. He talked about the specific decisions that had turned things around. He talked about the industry with the fluency of someone who understood it in his bones. I asked questions. I always asked questions. It is, I think, the thing about me that Jerry responded to most. Not any particular intelligence or talent, but the genuine interest. The willingness to sit still and go deep on a subject that most people my age found completely uninteresting. Specialty chemicals distribution is not a romantic subject. I found it fascinating. Not the chemistry exactly, but the system of it. The logistics, the margins, the relationship structures, the way a business like Meridian sat in the middle of supply chains for industries most people never thought about. My Aunt Roberta had an interior design firm. She had built it over 15 years into a business that served corporate clients, office fit-outs, hospitality renovations, commercial spaces. It was a real business, a good one, and Roberta ran it with the same energy she brought to everything, which was considerable. She had 12 employees. She had a client list that included several notable regional names. She was, in her professional life, genuinely accomplished. And I want to say that clearly because the rest of this story is not about Roberta being incompetent. It is about something else. What Roberta did not know, and what I did not know until Jerry told me when I was 29 years old, was that Meridian Supply Group was one of the primary suppliers to the commercial finishing industry in our region. Specialty coatings, surface treatments, the materials used in high-end commercial interior renovations, the products that Roberta's contractors applied to the walls and floors and surfaces of every corporate client she had ever served. Roberta's firm had been purchasing Meridian products, indirectly through the contractors she hired, but traceable in the supply chain, for 11 years. Her business ran in a supply chain sense on the foundation of what Jerry had built. She had no idea. There was no reason she would have had any idea. The supply chain is invisible to most people, which is precisely why it's so valuable to the people who understand it. Jerry told me this not as a revelation, not as ammunition, but as an example of how supply chain positioning works. He was teaching me, as he always was. I absorbed it, as I always did. And I stored it. Not because I planned to use it, but because storing things Jerry taught me had become a habit I didn't question. Jerry was diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition when he was 61. The progression was slow at first, then faster than anyone expected. He continued to run Meridian for 2 years after the diagnosis, with increasing support from his senior management team, and then he could not. He did not have children. He had been married once, briefly, in his 30s, and the marriage had ended without bitterness and without heirs. He had siblings, my father, and a younger sister, and he had me. The family assumed, in the way that families assume things that suit their expectations, that Meridian would be sold when Jerry could no longer run it. A business of that size, in that industry, would attract buyers. The proceeds would be distributed. Everyone would receive something comfortable. That was the story the family told itself, and the story required very little examination because it was convenient and it felt plausible. Jerry had a different plan. He had been working on it, with his attorney and his CFO, for the 3 years preceding the period when his condition became serious. He had restructured Meridian's ownership into a holding company. He had created a share class system that distinguished between economic interests and control interests. He had established a management trust to ensure operational continuity regardless of what happened at the ownership level. And he had, over a period of 18 months, transferred controlling interest in the holding company, 54% structured as voting shares, into a trust with a single beneficiary. I was 29 when he told me what he'd done. We were at lunch, our usual lunch, a diner he liked for reasons that had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the fact that no one he knew professionally would see him there. He told me across a table with a paper placemat, in the same tone he'd used to explain margin structures and logistics contracts, that he had made me the controlling owner of Meridian Supply Group. I did not respond immediately. Jerry let the silence sit, the way he always did when he'd said something that needed processing. Then I asked him why. He said because I was the only person in his life who had ever genuinely wanted to understand the thing he'd spent his life building. He said he didn't need me to run it. He had a management team for that. He needed the right person to own it. Someone who understood what it was for, who it affected, and why it mattered. He said he'd watched me for 15 years, and he was confident I was that person. Then he ate his sandwich and changed the subject. The transfer was not immediate. It completed formally when Jerry's condition reached the threshold specified in the trust document, a medical determination made by his doctors 18 months after our lunch. By that point, Jerry was in full-time care, comfortable and calm, his affairs in order. The management team had been briefed. Philip Crane, the CFO who had been with Meridian for 16 years, had been designated as the operational lead. Everything was arranged. The ownership transfer simply activated, like a clock reaching the hour it had been set for. I was 31 years old. I owned controlling interest in a company with 47 employees and annual revenues I will not state precisely, but which made my $1,100 checking account feel like a detail from someone else's life. I want to explain why I didn't tell anyone. It was not strategy initially, it was shock, and then it was caution, and then, after about 6 months of sitting with it and talking to Philip Crane and beginning to actually understand the scope of what Jerry had left me, it became something more deliberate. I was not ready. The company needed stability, not the disruption of a family announcement. My own understanding of what I now owned was still being built. And I had learned from Jerry that the most valuable things are often the ones you don't advertise. I kept my regular job, I kept my studio apartment. I kept my evening and weekend work. I told no one. I flew quietly to Meridian's offices once a month, sat in board meetings, learned the business from the inside in the way that Jerry had always taught me things. Slowly, concretely, with attention to the parts that most people overlooked. Philip Crane, who is one of the finest operational minds I have ever encountered, taught me things about the business that made our lunch conversations feel like a foundation I was finally beginning to build on. At Roberta's son's wedding, I had been the majority owner of Meridian Supply Group for 22 months. I sat at that table in my rental tuxedo and I listened to my aunt explain my failure to 6 people I barely knew, and I thought about the supply chain. I thought about the contractors Roberta's firm hired. I thought about the products those contractors applied. I thought about the distribution network that put those products in their hands. I nodded in my measured way and I said nothing, and I went home that night and I sat in my studio apartment and I felt, for the first time in a long time, something very close to peace. Not because of what I was going to do, because of what I already was. What happened next was not a confrontation. I want to be very clear about that because the story people expect here, the dramatic reveal, the speechless aunt, the scene at a family gathering, is not what actually happened. What happened was quieter than that, and in its quietness, I think, more final. 7 months after the wedding, I made my first significant move as the controlling owner of Meridian. I had been watching the company's distribution contracts for the better part of 2 years, and I had identified an opportunity, a mid-sized regional distributor that was struggling with the same margin pressures affecting the industry broadly, which Meridian was positioned to either acquire or to outcompete directly. I chose acquisition. It was the right call. Philip agreed. We closed the deal on a Thursday afternoon. The acquisition was covered in a regional trade publication 2 weeks later. Not front page, industry trade publications are not front page publications, but a solid mention, with my name, my title, and the name of the holding company. Roberta's assistant, I was told later, found the article while doing routine research on a supplier for an upcoming project. The supplier happened to fall within Meridian's distribution network. The assistant brought the article to Roberta and pointed out the name. Roberta apparently read it 3 times before she called her sister, my mother, to ask a question she already knew the answer to. My mother called me that evening. She said Roberta had called her. She said Roberta seemed very strange on the phone. She asked me if there was something she should know. I told her to tell Roberta that she was welcome to reach out to Philip Crane's office if she had questions about Meridian's supply chain relationships. Then I told my mother I loved her and I would call her Sunday, the way I always did. Roberta did call Philip's office. I know this because Philip told me, with the careful, neutral expression he maintained in all situations, that he had received a call from someone identifying herself as the owner of a design firm with a supply chain interest in Meridian's product lines. He said the caller had asked several questions and had seemed, in his professional assessment, quite overwhelmed by the answers. He said he had answered all questions accurately and completely, as was appropriate, and had offered to schedule a formal meeting if the caller wished to discuss a supply relationship. The meeting never happened. What happened instead was an email from Roberta to me, the first direct communication from her since the wedding, 6 months later, that was 2 paragraphs long and that I will not reproduce here, but that contained an apology, a request that I not hold what she had said against her professionally, and a question about whether my ownership of Meridian would affect her firm's existing supplier relationships. I read it twice. I thought about Jerry and the paper placemat and the sandwich he ate after telling me I was going to inherit his life's work. I thought about 15 years of lunches and questions and patience. I thought about what he would do. I wrote back a single paragraph. I told her that Meridian's supply relationships were managed by our operations team, and that any professional questions should be directed to Philip Crane. I told her that I didn't intend to hold personal matters against business relationships because I had been taught that keeping those things separate was the sign of a professional. I told her I hoped her firm was well. I did not mention the wedding. I did not need to. The email itself, the fact of its existence, the careful and slightly desperate professional courtesy of it, that was the conversation. That was the thing that had changed, stated without needing to be stated. Jerry died 14 months after the ownership transfer completed. He was in care, comfortable, the affairs he had spent years arranging fully in place. I was with him in the last week. We did not talk much. His capacity for long conversations had diminished significantly, but on one afternoon, when he was more alert than usual, he asked me how things were going at the company. I told him Philip was doing well. I told him about the acquisition. I told him we had brought on 3 new clients in a sector he had always wanted to develop. He listened with his eyes closed, and when I finished, he made a sound that I can only describe as satisfied, like a man who had checked something off a list he'd been keeping for a very long time. He died 4 days later, quietly, at his own pace, which was always his pace. I run Meridian differently than Jerry did, which he would have expected and, I think, wanted. I have pushed into markets he was cautious about. I have invested in technology he would have found unnecessary. I have made mistakes he probably would have warned me about, and I have learned from them in the way he taught me to learn from things, by understanding exactly what went wrong and why, not by looking for someone to blame. The company is larger than it was when he left it to me. The margins are better, the team is stronger. I think he would be pleased, though Jerry was not the kind of man who used the word pleased. He would probably just eat a sandwich and change the subject. Roberta and I have a professional relationship now. It is cordial. She attends the same family events I attend, and we speak to each other with the kind of careful respect that replaces what was there before. She has not said anything, at any family event, about my apartment or my career or the air-quoted word that she deployed at her son's wedding. I don't know whether that is because she is embarrassed or because she has genuinely reconsidered her opinions. I have stopped needing to know. My studio apartment, for the record, I still have. I could afford something significantly larger. I have simply found that I work better in small spaces, which Jerry would have understood. He kept his personal life modest for the same reason. The discipline of it, the clarity, the reminder that the number on a balance sheet is not the same thing as the quality of a life. I own half the supply chain funding her industry. I sit in her son's wedding photographs in a rental tuxedo, at a table where she explained my failure to 6 people I barely knew. And I think about that sometimes. Not with bitterness, but with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has understood, finally and completely, what they were being taught all along. Jerry taught me that the most powerful position in any system is the one that everyone depends on and no one thinks about. The supply chain, the foundation, the invisible thing that makes everything else possible. I was the supply chain. I just didn't know it yet. Before you go, I have one question, and I want you to think about it carefully. Has someone in your life ever seen your value before you saw it yourself? Has someone ever been patient with you in a way that only made sense later when you understood what they were waiting for you to become? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.